Thank you for joining us for session 5 of the annual symposium of SRAG. This one is addressing the new environment. The environment has always changed, but what we see is that it is changing at an increasing rate, and it is to a point where we can see, feel, and hear what is going on. Our environments, our neighborly interactions, and our natural and built environment. It all affects our health and our joy of living. So today we're going to look at the human interactions through 2 behavioral problems, not only what affects the health and the environment, but then managing the burden of the human footprint on the environment. Our first speaker today will be Dr. Sybil Anwander. She will be speaking on the net carbon goal of 0 by 2015 and how Rotary will be able to go and participate in that. Dr. Sybil Anwander has worked as a researcher and lecturer in the field of agricultural economics at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology before she took the lead in the public affairs and sustainability with the Swiss Retailer Co-op. She served on various boards, business initiatives for sustainable supply chains, and she's been the head of economics for the Federal Office for the Environment with a special focus on sustainable consumption and production, as well as resource economics and sustainable finance. She now lives in Hamburg, and she's working as an independent consultant for sustainability with expertise in the potentials of natural carbon solutions working towards net zero. Thank you, Sybil, for joining this panel discussion.
Thank you, Rick, for the introduction. Yes, let's talk about climate change and why it is important not only to talk, but really urgently to act, and how we can do so as Rotary. A huge challenge is laying ahead of us. We have to limit global warming to 1.2 to 2 degree maximum in order to stay within the safe operating space for humanity and to avoid critical developments. We have a kind of budget to emit greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. This is the line marked in yellow and under the number 4, well below the line if no action at all are taken. The business as usual is the red line with the number 1. If all the commitments made by the diverse governments in the framework of the Paris Agreement, if they would have been achieved, we would see a curbing the curve to still higher as what is recommended by the scientists. But let's be honest, most countries are lagging behind, A, in bringing these commitments from the Paris Agreement into binding national laws, and B, with the implementation of these laws. This means that the voluntary reduction of CO2 emissions by companies, by cities and organizations, and by people like you and me are very urgently in need, beyond what is or will get mandatory by law. And still, this is not enough. We have to think of ways how we can take out CO2 from the atmosphere, capture from the atmosphere, and store it in the soil. And you will see nature can be a big help for us. That is this negative emission, the sequestration. And besides the technical solutions, there are a lot of nature-based carbon solutions. We are currently in an unbalanced situation. Anthropogenic GHG emissions are still much higher than what it is removed from the atmosphere. Or if we take the picture of the CO2 budget, we are still consuming our budget and very soon are entering into a debt situation. We borrow from the next generation, from the Friday for future generation. The German Constitutional Court just issued a very important judgment end of April this year, saying that the proposed German climate law is against the Constitution as it is not ambitious enough and shifts the burden to reduce CO2 emissions to the next generation, which will therefore not have the same degree of freedom. It calls for intergenerational justice. And even now, not all the people are equally suffering from the consequences of global warming. It is also the question of interspatial justice. Rich and highly industrialized countries have emitted more CO2 into the atmosphere, consumed more of this budget, but are on average less affected by climate change than many countries in the global south. If we have a look at the emissions in different countries, and if we travel back by 60 years, then we see that the US, but also Russia, the former Soviet Union, and China, as well as part of Europe, had the highest emissions at that time. The global south, with Latin America and Africa, were not really contributing to CO2 emissions. 60 years later, the number of countries with high and very high emissions has increased. Emissions in some have increased, and the country with highest emissions is now China. Relevant reduction of emissions, ? Changes to fossil-free energy, not really visible. The big turnaround has not yet started. If we have a look at the greenhouse gas emissions that are related to the international flows of goods and services, we see two big arrows, one from China to Europe and the other one, a bigger one, from China to the US. So if we want to stop global warming, we have to help China and the countries around to produce the goods we consume in the wealthy countries in a more sustainable way. Global warming is and will remain a common challenge that needs our joint efforts. Taking these indirect emissions into account, then there is still a huge disparity on the average per capita CO2 emission, the carbon footprints in the different countries. These disparities can be explained by differences in the lifestyle, the level of consumption, the infrastructure, the availability of fossil-free energy, and also differences in the diets. It also indicates that there is still a huge potential for reduction on the individual level if we compare the per capita CO2 emissions in the US and Canada to the one in Brazil or India. So everything starts with knowing your own carbon footprint. Many footprint calculators are in the internet for free, some of them quite simply based on a couple of lifestyle indicators, others more detailed and considering the country you are living in. I like the first two best as they are adapted for very different countries and lifestyles. The footprint calculator is not limited to carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions, but takes into account also the capacity to absorb CO2 from reforestation, for example. It relates more to the biocapacity of a country. Carbon footprints for companies and organizations are much more complicated to calculate. There is an international standard, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, to make such calculations comparable and to make sure that also the supply chains, thus indirect carbon emissions, are taken into account. In many companies, these emissions are much higher than the ones directly attributable to a company. So what can you do if you want to reduce your personal carbon footprint? There are 5 areas of intervention where it's really worth to look at it a little bit closer. First of all, it's living and housing. So a reduction of the surface per capita, the insulation of your home and reducing heating or cooling temperature is an advice. You should check whether it's possible to heat or cool with renewable energy, and you should switch to energy-saving appliances and lighting. In the field of the mobility, we could consider to change to a smaller and more efficient car. use public transportation more frequently, change to e-mobility if the power comes really from renewable energy, and use your bicycle more often, also for commuting, not only for leisure time. That is for sure also good for your health. Diet is an important issue. We could all reduce our meat consumption and change our diets to more plant-based alternatives. We really should avoid food waste, and it's preferable to choose regional and seasonal products and organic foods. We will see later on why it is important. With regard to traveling, we should reduce our national and international flights, wherever possible, switch to trains. And with general consumption, we could try to reduce our consumption level, especially with regard to clothes and furniture. We really should choose sustainably produced goods and services, take more care, better care of things, repair them, prefer circular products with closed loops, and we should avoid single-use products also to avoid waste. What does it mean as a society, as a country, as a company, or an organization like Rotary to become net zero? It means that every household, every company, every organization has to take measures to prevent, reduce, and eliminate greenhouse gas emissions wherever possible within their own boundaries, including the value chains, including the emissions related to the production of the goods and services we consume. That's the abatement. Emissions that are not avoidable or not avoidable in short term, they should be compensated for by helping others to reduce and avoid their emissions, especially in the global south. That's compensation. And then we come to neutralization. It will be necessary to take carbon out from the atmosphere, either by sequestration of carbon dioxide in the soil and binding it at the organic matter, or, and this is still a very costly way, by technical carbon capturing. But we are lucky. Nature can help and can become an important ally on our journey towards carbon positive. Besides the urgently needed change towards fossil-free energy, we rely on nature to reduce and avoid CO2 emission, as well as to store carbon dioxide in the soil. There are 4 ecosystems where we can invest in nature-based solutions: in the forests, where we should protect existing forests in good shape, but also try to manage them better and to restore them as carbon sinks. Grassland and croplands, it should be better protected and better managed in order to allow carbon sequestration in healthy soils. And finally, wetlands like mangroves and marshlands, which should be protected and restored when needed. So that's how natural climate solutions look like in grassland, with reforestation and avoided conversion, in grassland and agriculture with, again, avoided conversion, biochar or agroforestry, improved agricultural practices, and then in wetlands is the protection and restoration of coastal wetlands and avoided impacts if we protect and restore peatland, for example. And the story is actually quite simple. Area that is covered with plants will absorb CO2 and water from the atmosphere, where a bare soil gives away CO2 and water to the atmosphere. As over half of agricultural land worldwide has become more or less dead soils with no or very little organic matter, soil has become if not the major source of CO2, instead of being a natural and actually comparatively cheap sink of CO2. 2015 was the International Year of the Soil. Soil is much more than the dirt under our shoes. A handful of fertile, rich soil contains as many organisms, microbes, and insects as all human beings on this planet. So what can I do as a single Rotarian to fix the planet and to contribute to fight against climate change with these natural solutions? You can start your own compost and turn your garden in a natural one with fertile, rich soils, rich in organic substances. You could green the roof and facade of your house. You could buy organic food and support farmers that really are aware of the importance of healthy and fertile soils. And you can lobby also within your company to change to organic food in your canteen. And you can compensate your own CO2 footprint, which we have seen is quite important, and support projects based on nature-based solutions. And what can we do as a Rotary Club? We can start an awareness information campaign showing the interdependencies between climate change on the one hand and the loss of biodiversity on the other hand. You can explain the win-win potential of nature-based solution, and you can bring this knowledge and understanding also into the schools. You could contribute hands-on in the protection and restoration of forests, moorlands and mangroves around your city and county. You could initiate carbon-friendly gardens in your community and organize trainings how to start a compost and how to get healthy soils. And you could initiate nature-based solution project fundable from this June on via the Rotary Foundation. I have some concrete ideas that could be done, what could be done to reduce carbon emissions and to store carbon in the soil while improving the living conditions on the local population. The first one is a pyrolysis project in Vietnam, starting from the biological waste as a byproduct of coffee production. If not stored correctly, there's quite a huge amount of emission of methane or CO2 when we burn this byproduct. Pyrolysis is an old technology with anaerobic burning that produces then biochar, which improves soil fertility. It also produces energy that can be used to dry the coffee, and that's a simple technology that can be multiplied in other cooperatives in Vietnam and other countries. There had been a couple of partners to implement this project and could also be an interesting idea for a Rotarian project. Another one is the example of a community-based reforestation to make better use of underutilized land and create new jobs and revenues. Here, the important point is the CO2 reduction, which allows for the sale of certificates, but it also helps to increase and make farm income more diverse, to improve the quality of life, especially for women with energy efficient stoves. It increases the supply of locally and sustainably produced wood and reduces forest degradation with better management practices, and improves also water regulation, flood control and water security. Also here, it has been a handful of organizations to implement this project, but could be also an interesting idea for a Rotary Club. And another one, a third one, is with regard to coral reef protection here in Madagascar. The starting point here is the fact that nearly 20% of global CO2 emissions related to deforestation comes from the loss of mangroves, and from the other fact that one area of mangroves can bind more CO2 than the Amazonian pine forest. So it's really an important and interesting thing for CO2. And also here we have the project benefits with the CO2 reduction leading to the sale of certificates. It helps to increase and diversify the income of coastal people. It also helps to protect against flooding and storms, and produces fuel, wood and construction material, and increases also the food security with improved crab and shrimp fishing. So that's really win-win-win situations. So what are the learnings from this three projects? They're all long-term and rather complex projects. Positive impacts might only be seen after 5 to 15 years. The involvement of the local population has been key in all the three examples. It's also one thing that is demanded by the Rotary Foundation. Oftentimes, quite an important investment is needed at the beginning, which can then be refinanced with the benefits from the project itself, from the sale of CO2 certificates, or also with improved production. So Rotary clubs will need to cooperate with other partners to get started with such projects. And in order to achieve the intended benefits, professional planning and implementation is needed. ESRAG can support in the development phase, and local experts should also be integrated. Impact measurement is very important and should be based on a comprehensive baseline assessment at the beginning of the project. So to summarize, we are starting on an important journey with the avoidance and reduction of CO2 emissions, with the compensation, and also with becoming increasingly carbon negative by replacing fossil-based energy by renewable energy. We can really help others to reduce and avoid CO2 emissions with compensation projects, and we can protect nature and make croplands, forests and wetlands as a sink for carbon. And we can contribute to intergenerational and interspatial justice by linking measures to fight against climate change with social goals. And so it will be possible to have a good living within the boundaries of our planet. So let's make a pledge to become net zero by 2040, by 2050, if at the latest, because we have the understanding and the knowledge about the climate change and how to protect against it. We have the technologies, they are available. We know that it is affordable and economically wise to invest now in sustainable infrastructure instead of cleaning up damages later on. And because it's our responsibility towards future generation, and because it's so much potential also for biodiversity and the nature. And because we are the last generation that has the possibility, the freedom to make a good choice. So there will be other information. Oh, I think we have to stop. Sorry. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to an interesting discussion.
Thank you, Sybil. That was a wonderful talk, and it's funny, as much as you think you may understand about the cycle that would bring us back to net zero, you always learn more from talking with experts. So we really appreciate your input here. Did have a few comments and a few questions. One question was that as the Earth is 70% ocean, can you comment on the ocean as a heat and CO2 sink without biodiversity damage and sea level rise?
You refer to the oceans as CO2 sinks, is that correct?
Correct.
Yes, I didn't mention this in my presentation, but of course, oceans are an important sink of CO2. But still, if we bring in CO2 into the ocean, into the water, there is a chemical reaction that takes acid into the ocean and makes oceans more, more sour, if you want to. which has negative impacts actually on the biodiversity in the ocean itself. We see that with the bleaching of the coral reefs, we see it also with the disturbances in biodiversity into the ocean. So yes, we believe that the ocean is an unlimited thing, but it's not. It changes also the microclimate in the ocean. So we can't rely only on the absorption capacity of the oceans.
Thank you. Another question was that China is installing as many vehicle recharging stations for electrical vehicles now per month as the US has installed totally. They are in the process of a huge transition to electric vehicles. How quickly will installations of charging systems and transition to electrical vehicles take to really get the CO2 emissions down?
First of all, we have to make the transformation in the energy system, because as long as we only transform coal into electric power and then bring it into our cars, there's nothing changed. We really have to switch to renewable energies by wind power, solar power, and only then it really makes sense to switch to e-mobility. Mm. And the other one is, how can we store renewable energy in a safe and a good way? So also the transformation via hydropower is not a very efficient process for so far, but I think that's an important storage capacity that we should use. But I think that's another important issue we have to think very closely, but it's not a really easy, it's not an easy transformation to switch fossil-driven mobility to electricity-driven mobility. We also have to change our understanding of mobility and maybe rethink our need for mobility and whether we really need such big cars with 1 or 2 tons per person that we move around, things like that. So it's one side is the energy, the other side is our understanding of mobility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Union of Concerned Scientists actually did an analysis in the US back when we got our first EV, and it calculated the CO2 equivalent in terms of miles per gallon of driving an electric car for each area, depending on how they source the electricity. And where I live, driving a full EV still had the CO2 equivalent of a 41 mile per gallon car because of all the CO2 that was released due to coal-fired power plants.
That's the point, yeah.
And one last was more of a comment. If you don't know if you've heard of the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas in the USA, it's one of the organizations that's developing perennial grains with very long root systems. And they've shown that those will increase the carbon content of the soil by 5-fold. So we've had some. It's actually very good. We have some actually sitting in the kitchen. It's a great grain. It's really nutty. But those are other ones that are out there in terms of trying to increase the carbon content of the soil and reduce the need for replanting and tilling. Okay, thank you very much, Sybil. This was a really informative talk, and it was just a pleasure to listen to you and to interact with you. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And